Okay, well, I wanted to ask you, first of all, to start off asking you how you think Zionism has corrupted Judaism, not Judaism, the Jewish identity in the modern world from within. I wanted to, this one writer named Mark Ellis uses the term Constantinian Judaism to describe the transformation. And he basically speaks of Constantinian Judaism to evoke like a turn in Judaism towards serving state power and secular power at the expense of keeping up an authentic tradition and a diasporic tradition. And so, just as Christianity was corrupted by Constantine's and the assumption of state power by Christianity, this now happens with how Judaism is practiced in the modern world.
Let me introduce myself first of all. I'm Dr. Abraham Weizfeld. My full name, my full Jewish name is Abraham Yecheskel Weizfeld Goldscheider. And I come from a Yiddish background in Poland. My parents each came from Poland before the Holocaust and Warsaw and Lvov. And my first language, consequently, is Yiddish. Although I was born in Toronto, I was conceived in a refugee camp in Breslau, in Germany, after the war. My parents survived in the Soviet Union during the war. Now, Zionism is an aberration of both Judaism and Jewish political culture. It does not originate within either Judaism or Jewish political culture. What Mark Ellis refers to as Constantinian Judaism is merely a consequence of the corruption of Judaism and Jewish political culture by Zionism, which originates in Europe. Zionism did not originate in the Jewish Arab political culture. It originated in the European Jewish political culture. The reason for which was that the European nation state, which was a Christian nation state, never provided for Jewish liberty within the context of those countries, even though they claimed to be developing democracy. Now, what the French Revolution provided in terms of liberties were not extended to the Jewish people until the advent of the Napoleonic Code, even. And even then, the Napoleonic Code only provided for individual Jewish civil rights as a citizen, but not as a Jewish citizen. That is, there were no collective Jewish rights, and individual Jewish citizens were subject to discrimination for being Jewish in practically a legal manner. And this is why Dreyfus was discriminated against and targeted as a spy, merely because he had some relations living in Germany, when in fact it was another French officer who had equally Jewish relations in Germany, who sympathized with Germany and was the spy, and who was not Jewish. But even then, at that time, I believe it was necessary for Jews in France to convert to being Christians in order to have a position as an officer in the French military. Much the same way that Spain, under the Christian rule of Queen Isabella, required Spanish Jews, Latino Jews, to convert to Christianity if they wanted to have any higher position in the civil service. And even then, they were called conversos or new Christians, and eventually either expelled, deported, or executed for having been Jewish at some point previously in their family's history. So it demonstrated that the nation-state concept was a European concept only, and defined the nation in religious terms. This affected the Jewish political culture tremendously, and eventually led to the Holocaust, which considered that the nation-state of Germany would not tolerate any other nation but a German nation that was defined in religious Christian terms. So the Lutheran revolution of the Reformation created an independent nation-state that was independent in the German sense of the Holy Roman Empire, of the authority of the Pope in Rome, by means of creating a Protestant religious stream called Lutheranism, which had as its motivation the creation of an independent political entity, providing liberty for the German people, but in a very discriminatory way. Now, Zionism concluded that this historical methodology was necessary. They considered it a historical necessity to do so. And they adopted the same methodology and said that, well, if the Christians are going to establish their own nation-state in their own name, then the Jewish people should do the same and establish a Jewish nation-state in their own name, excluding any other nation, just as the Jews have been excluded from Germany and from Europe. And they, because they realized that Jewish liberty in Europe was not feasible under such a Christian nation-state. So instead of opposing the Christian nation-state, they adopted the same methodology and chose to implement it in their own name with the alliance of those Christian nation-states, which considered that the Jews didn't belong in their Christian nation-state, and therefore the Jews should go to their Jewish nation-state and incidentally form an outpost of European colonization. That's the true origin of Zionism. And this has corrupted Jewish political culture, and in particular, it has destroyed a great part of the Jewish political culture, in particular, the Yiddish language. Now, I'm a Yiddish speaker who can speak with nobody. Nobody speaks Yiddish except for the Hasidim, who only use Yiddish at home as an oral language, because Hebrew is a sacred language. It's used for reading the Sefer Torah. It was never meant, to be a language to be used orally. In fact, even the ancient Israelites did not speak Hebrew as a daily oral language. They spoke Aramaic. So Zionism comes along and says, that they're going to adopt the legitimacy of some passages in the Torah, which were edited by Ezra, incidentally, and claim Hebrew as a justification for establishing a Jewish nation-state in the land that was not even ancient Israel. Tel Aviv is not situated in where ancient Israel was located.
Mostly the West Bank is where ancient Israel is.
Ancient Israel, the kingdoms of David and Solomon were located in the West Bank. Okay, and even then, they were only located in a pluralistic fashion. There was various nations who lived together in that kingdom. There was no nation-state established at that time.
Yeah, it didn't exist.
It didn't exist as a concept.
Yeah.
And the kingdom that existed was a small kingdom that incorporated many other nations, and incorporated these other nations even in the family of Solomon himself, in terms of his various wives from the different nations, who he married in order to provide for various peace pacts and treaties, which provided for the stability of society at that time. So it was a pluralistic society, and not a nation-state in any sense whatsoever.
So you said, what would have been, instead of Zionism going off and establishing its own nation-state on the model of the European exclusionary nation-states, what would have been a way for them to stay and oppose, to stay and fight?
Well, in Poland, the Jewish workers' movement formed a civil rights movement, in much the same way that the African Americans did, and they developed it into a political party and a trade union federation called the Jewish Bund, Jewish Labour Bund, or the General Union of Jewish Workers in Latvia and Russia, in Poland. And my mother was a member of the Bund, and so was her brother, who became a partisan during the Nazi invasion of Russia. And this Jewish Bund, which means union, was of the opinion that the Jewish people who lived in Poland were legitimately Polish, as legitimate as any other Polish person. They had lived there for over 500 years. They spoke Polish. They spoke Polish to each other even in the home, as well as Yiddish. My parents spoke to each other in Polish, not Yiddish. With me, they spoke in Yiddish. They were as Polish as any other Polish person, only they were Jewish as well. They had a dual identity, because to be Jewish is to have a national identity, as well as a religion. Not every Jewish person is necessarily religious or of the same brand of religious practice, Therefore, the common denominator is a national identity, not a religious identity. In fact, the Jewish people are one of the least religious nations in the world nowadays. Only about 20% of Jewish people are religious, but the Jewish national identity continues to exist. And the Jewish Bund was based upon this national identity. They did not take an anti-religious position, they took a non-religious position. So Jews of various currents were members without any problem. Now,
and that itself is a bit of a secular post-enlightenment concept, maybe, the idea that there is a national identity separate from religious identity, the very ability to take a non-religious cultural perspective is maybe a modern...
It was modern, what was called Haskalah in Yiddish or Hebrew, the modernist trend, which was not anti-religious necessarily. Spinoza developed this methodology in which he incorporated modern scientific thought and methodology and provided an update, basically, of Judaism, which allowed Judaism to adopt newer ideas without contradicting or casting aside the traditional ideas and values. So the Jewish Bund developed on the civil rights basis as an alternative to Zionism. In fact, it was anti-Zionist. And it was a member of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Revolutionary Socialist Party, which incorporated both the what became the Bolsheviks, what was the Mensheviks, and the third component was the Jewish Bund. But the Jewish Bund...
It was on an equal level at first with the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks.
Not equal, it was greater. You know, the Jewish Bund had 35,000 members in 1903. The Iskra group of Lenin had 8,000 members only. The Mensheviks had something equal to that. The Jewish Bund was enormous compared to the other revolutionary tendencies. That's why in 1903, both the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks united at the opening of the Congress to expel the Jewish Bund. That was their first action.
Really? That was the first action of the Union?
The first resolution, yes. Without notice, they were set up. They were expelled from the Congress and of the party, the Social Democratic Revolutionary Socialist Party. And then the division between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks took place afterwards. And because the Jewish Bund had been expelled, the Bolsheviks ended up being a majority. Otherwise, they would have remained a minority of the Congress.
Why was why was the Bund expelled?
Both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks adopted the Marxist definition of nationhood. They considered a nation to be a state. They were statists, as Marx was a statist. Marx was a young Hegelian, and Hegel developed the concept of nation-state and the state itself, from which he considered the civil society to be subordinate to the state. This is an error, a fundamental error of Marxism, which led to the Bolsheviks actually adopting the same form of the bourgeois state which was developing in Russia under the Tsar. The state that the Bolsheviks took over and perpetuated had the same frontiers as before, had the same centralized administration as before, the same centralized army under Trotsky as before, and this led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. The first thing they did in 1926 is they dissolved the Soviets, even though the slogan of the revolution was all power to the Soviets. So after expelling the Bund, they dissolved the Soviets when the revolution succeeded. Then,
years after 1917.
Yes.
Yeah.
You see, it was all part of the same formula of what power is. They defined power as a state apparatus in which there was a party that was supposed to be implementing a dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of the state. And who was to represent the state? The party. Which party? One party, the Communist Party, because there's only one class, and the class is supposed to be a unified working class without any differentiation. In other words, workers were supposed to abandon their national identity. And that's why the Bund was expelled in 1903. Even though the Bund continued to exist, and the Bund gave strategic and tactical support to the Russian Revolution, even though it was being led by the Bolsheviks. And the Bund came and offered its support to the Bolshevik government. And what happened is that Stalin, in 1936, I believe, actually arrested the leaders of the Bund, Ehrlich and Alter, because they had formed a Jewish anti-fascist committee, which was an independent committee, independent of the Communist Party. And Stalin would not allow any political formations that were independent of the Communist Party. He arrested the leaders, put the Jewish communists in their place, take over the Jewish anti-fascist committee, put them in prison, and interrogated them. Ehrlich, wrote a great deal at that time, which needs to be published. But eventually he was executed. No, it's not published yet. And Alter committed suicide a couple of years after that. So, and the Nazis, of course, destroyed the nearly entire membership of the Jewish Bund in Warsaw, etc. So the Bund was devastated by both the Nazis and by the Stalinists. But it survived nonetheless. And here I am. I was raised as a Bundist by my mother. Secretly anti-Zionist. My mother was my secret collaborator against the Zionist movement in Toronto when I started the campaign to criticize the Zionist leadership in Toronto as early as 1966-67.
So the communists couldn't handle the Bund having a dual identity as full members of the working class struggle, but also having a separate autonomous national identity as Jews.
That's right, precisely. And they could not tolerate neither the Ukrainian working class having its own identity. Makhno, who was an anarchist leader, was leading the Ukrainian revolution against the White Army in the Russian Revolution. He was not allowed the autonomy of the Ukrainian people, even by Trotsky. Trotsky offered to integrate, the Makhnovichny, who were the anarchist fighters against the White Army, the Tsarist army, into the Red Army. And he offered Makhno a position as a general. Makhno turned this position down because he wanted to maintain the autonomy of the Ukrainian forces because they were fighting for an independent Ukraine. They always wanted an independent Ukraine from the Tsarist Empire, and they still wanted independence, of the Ukraine from the Bolshevik Empire, which is basically the same empire as the Tsarist Empire, same frontiers. So Bolshevism adopted the same form as the Tsarist Empire, the same state, the same frontiers, the same repression. And that eventually led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. One of the major factors was national rebellions against Russian control or influence in their countries, in particular Afghanistan.
Yeah. But so it's interesting how whereas the Bund sought to maintain a duality, a dual identity between national identity as Jews, but also full participation in the Polish struggle or the Russian struggle or Latvian struggle, Zionism and Palestine attempted to collapse that duality into a single identity, whereas state and society were one, where the national Jewish identity immediately coincided with the membership in the state, with the situation.
The Zionists are so fanatical on that point, they don't even allow an Israeli identity to be established. There is no such thing as an Israeli national identity in Israel. There is only a Jewish identity. Even though 2/3 of the Jewish people in the world do not have a vote in the Israel elections. They're taxed, nonetheless, by the Jewish National Fund, but they don't have a vote. So Jewish Americans, for instance, are taxed without a vote, and in American history, this is called taxation without representation. It was the major reason why there was an American Revolution against the British colonial empire. So that's why I advocate a Jewish revolution against Zionism, for the independence of the Jewish people from the state of the Zionists. Because it's not a state of the Jewish people. This is not a Jewish nation state. In reality, this is a Zionist nation state, or a Zionist state. They don't, there may be an Israeli nation now, but it is not a Jewish nation. It is an Israeli nation, and it is Zionist, and it does not represent the Jewish people. And by the way, I use the term Jewish. The Jew is an American term which derives from a British insult to the Jewish people. In the 1933 edition of the Oxford Dictionary, you will find Jew defined as an insult.
Really?
Yes. In fact, that's what the Nazis used to define the Jewish people as an insult. You know, in the yellow star that was imposed upon everybody to wear, and in the center it said Yid. Yid means Jew. It's an insult.
What would the alternative term be?
Jewish.
So the word.
It's an adjective. You know, there is no such thing as a Jew. It is not an entity in and of itself. There is a Jewish person because we are people. We are not an object. The term Jew is an objectification of Jewish people in terms of alienation theory.
So what would your Jewish revolution again be? Zionism be? It would be international Jewish revolution.
We have formed an international Jewish opposition to Zionism now. There are various Jewish organizations that are either anti-occupation or anti-Zionist. There is, for instance, now even the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network that was initiated in the United States and now extends elsewhere. There is the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is very principled. There is J Street. And altogether, the number of members of these various organizations in the United States alone is 190,000. The Zionists have only 130,000 members in the United States. We are now stronger than the Zionist movement.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I mean, the official members in the Zionist movement.
That's right, in the Zionist organizations. But they have a lot of supporters and sympathizers who donate, etc. But they are not, the Zionists per se. In fact, the fact that all of these Jewish Americans live outside of the Zionist state defines them as, objectively speaking, non-Zionist. Although they're not anti-Zionist for sure. But the fact that they refuse the Zionist ideological imperative of going to live in the state that the Zionists have created means that they are non-Zionist. They have no intention of going to live there, and until recently even only 20% of Jewish Americans even bothered to go to visit Israel.
Until recently?
Until programs like Birthright, because they realized that this was a big problem for them to maintain their ideological hegemony. So they brought young Jewish Americans over to be indoctrinated.
So back in Russia, there was a time when the Jewish community was split between Bundism and Zionism, where they almost hold opposing tendencies, like one advocating diaspora involvement in international struggle, and one advocating separatism.
Yes, they were separatists, segregationists. They wanted to segregate the Jewish people in Israel. They wanted the Polish Jewish people to leave Poland and go to Palestine. And even though their own members didn't do so, and very few, people actually did go to Palestine at that age. And in the 1936 municipal elections, the Jewish Bund got more votes than the Zionists. It was a stronger political tendency.
So you believe that to effectively combat Zionism from within the Jewish people, it's necessary to craft a new Jewish identity. That because the modern Jewish identity is so bound up right now with Zionism and the state of Israel. I remember you were telling me before that it's necessary really to recraft what it means to be Jewish.
Well, I think that reasserting Jewish identity is the problematic. A Jewish American culture is very strong. It's not Israeli. It's not Zionist. It is Jewish. And it is also American. And has contributed greatly to American political culture as well. But it is nonetheless Jewish. I know there is this tendency, the melting pot idea in the United States, that if you're American, you're American, you're American. But it happens to be that Jewish Americans are also Jewish in spite of all of that. So this has to be asserted, in an independent fashion. And Jewish identity has to be rebuilt without feigning allegiance, to the Zionist state, which is artificial and is not representative of the actuality of Jewish political culture in North America or any other country like France, England, South Africa, or Australia, it just is false. It has no truth to it. The Israelis can keep and develop their identity, which is very much also a Palestinian identity, even though they don't realize it.
Things like hummus and
yes, where do they get this from? If they say that this is the ancient Israelite culture, well, then it's the Palestinians who have preserved this culture and not the Jewish people. Maybe the Jewish people in part, with Passover and all that, but the Palestinians, in fact, are more representative of ancient Jewish culture than modern Jewish societies. And in fact, you will find in history that if you choose to make any research on the matter, that a large percentage of the Palestinian people are actually ancient Jewish people.
Yeah, converted to Islam.
Who converted to Islam, or who did not convert to Islam, like the Jewish Palestinians who live on top of the mountain over there.
Yeah.
The Sumerians.
Yeah.
They're still there.
Yeah. But a large part of you aim to make a new international boon. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, that's the major point that remains to be elaborated. The political voice for the resurgent Jewish identity has to be the Jewish Bund. One, because the Jewish Bund was proven correct in its critique of Zionism, in the sense that it was not necessary for Jewish people to run away to Palestine in order to preserve their identity. Jewish people are not going to be assimilated. Jewish people maintain their identity even though they live as members of other societies. Jewish people are strong enough to be able to maintain a dual identity. The concept of a dual identity is missing from Zionism and also the Christian nation-state concept. You can have more than one identity. You can speak more than one language. Humans are not limited to being just one thing. That is just an objectification of what it is to be Jewish. To be Jewish is to be creative, is to develop new ideas, to adopt new ideas, to learn from other cultures, and to fuse them with what the Jewish people have developed from the various cultures that we have learned from, to develop an internationalist culture which is very dynamic and has helped to bring about even the Renaissance in Europe, because we transmitted the knowledge of the Middle East to Europe.
Oh, really?
Yes, because the Europeans had suppressed the knowledge of the Middle East. For instance, the library in Alexandria was burned by the Romans, Mark Antony, one time. The second time, it was burned by the Arab Christians who adopted the Christianity at the time of 600 AD.
Why did they do that?
Because no other book but the Gospels was supposed to be read by people.
So the Greek.
So all the other books, were considered to be pagan. Even the scientific books were considered to be pagan, and they were burned. Although they were smuggled out, by the intelligentsia at the time. In particular, there was a woman philosopher at the Library of Alexandria in 600 AD who helped preserve the knowledge of the Middle East. And there's a film about her called Agora, a very important film. All her books were burned. None of her books survived. She was also a scientist and an astronomer. She developed an elaboration of a sun-centric theory of the solar system as well, after Aristarchus, the Greek. And she developed the theory of elliptical orbits, very important advanced scientific knowledge. And her name was Phileton. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it should be researched further. Yes. So it is the Jewish people who were able to transmit the suppressed culture of the Middle East into Europe, and this is what helped to produce the Renaissance in terms of the writings of Aristotle, etc., which were then brought from the preserved transcripts. Yes. And as you might know, the earliest version of the Sefer Torah was only preserved in Greek from Alexandria.
Yeah, it was translated into Greek.
Yes. Yes. So, Jewish people have been very crucial in terms of preserving their own culture and that of others as well. Now, the Jewish Bund has to reassert itself and develop as an alternative international to the Zionist International. We are in the process of doing so. There are various Jewish Bund chapters everywhere now, but we're not united. And we have to seek a way to do so from an international.
And obviously the Bund was a socialist organization that was against capitalism and imperialism.
Yes.
And so would that be a crucial...
Yes, I still think it is, yes. Even though the Jewish working class is much smaller than it was, or has become transformed into a class of intellectual workers, nonetheless we work.
Yeah. And the same transformation has happened with other groups.
Of course, yeah. So all the working classes are being transformed, not just the Jewish working class. Marx thought that most of the Jewish people were bourgeois because he only saw Jewish bourgeois people in Germany. And a lot of people nowadays say that the Jewish people are only middle class, but both of these conceptions are stereotypes and they're wrong. As many other people, Jewish people are predominantly working people, perhaps very well educated working people, but nonetheless professionals who work at one thing or another, and are intellectual workers, if not ordinary workers. And the problem of organizing these workers, the new workers, presents itself not only for the Jewish people but for any other people as well. And the level of unionization in the United States is very low. It's like 15%. So the same thing holds true, for the Jewish people. Now we have to organize ourselves independently of the Zionist International, independently of the Jewish bourgeoisie, which supports the Zionist International. It's basically their political party of various forms. And we have to reassert the Jewish identity both in terms of our political culture, in terms of the contributions we've made to socialist theory of the various Jewish political prophets, so to speak. Also in terms of social theory, in terms of civil rights movements, and in particular the concept of national cultural autonomy, which should be practiced not only for the Jewish people, but also for other national minorities as well, so we can form federated societies in which the civil society becomes independent of the state. And in that way we can have true democracy for everyone.
So national cultural autonomy is an ethnic or a culture. It's a concept that allows for a plurality of different cultures to exist autonomously side by side, not impinging on the rights of other cultures, but it allows human beings also to have multiple identities.
Yes, multiple languages, independent religious expressions, theocratic, thought if they wish, and in a system of coexistence is the political term we use, in terms of a federation based upon what is called mutual aid.
That was like Kropotkin's.
Yes, right. But the concept of federation comes from Proudhon, the French anarchist theorist, who wrote a book called The Federal Principle. But he never elaborated in terms of national identity. The anarchists, missed out on recognizing that civil society was composed of various national communities.
And that was an idea that was, given testament to in the 20th century. There are various revolutions that occurred that were articulated on nationalist lines in some sense. Cultures used their own distinctive traditions to revolt against imperialism that was trying to homogenize communism also.
Yes, but there are limitations to that particular series of revolts because they were based upon the Leninist and the Wilsonian, President Wilson's concept of self-determination. But what those meant by self-determination was self-determination as a nation-state, that is, separatism. Now, although Lenin, said yes, nations have a right to separate, he was opposed to it for the reasons of maintaining links of the working class, which was well motivated, but he had no real mechanism to do so. And eventually, of course, these nations chose to separate because they were not offered any alternative in a federation. and they became nation states in and of themselves, like Ukraine is now, separate. And then the same problems they imposed upon the national minorities within Ukraine or within any other newly independent nation state, which then chose to oppress their national minorities, just as they themselves were oppressed previously because they were following the methodology of a nation state. So the concept of self-determination is flawed and needs to be critiqued because it is based upon the nation-state concept. One has to substitute the concept of autodetermination, which is autonomous self-determination, rather than determination only for oneself in an individualistic sense, only for the one. Rather, one should seek one's autodetermination in conjunction with the same principle of autodetermination on the part of other social formations as well. And this includes women. Women have to have their own autodetermination. But to say that women should separate from men and have their own independent society, which that would mean in effect, the extinction of the species. So the logic of it, doesn't make any sense when you look at it in that context. So one has to find another way to achieve a determination of a given social formation, which is autonomous, has power for itself, is not subordinate to any other social formation, yet coexists in the same society.
So could an example of this opposition also be found in the Black civil rights movement in the 60s, where one group, called for Black civil rights in America, whereas one group claimed to go back to Africa?
Yeah, the Garveyist tendency of Liberia turned out to be a disaster. Yeah, it's a sort of a Zionist concept.
That's interesting.
Yes, it's similar. Yes. And the civil rights movement was basically a movement for integration, which is what we want, for national minorities, but not assimilation.
So that's the Bundist concept too.
Integration, but not assimilation. Yes. Basically, because assimilation is impossible. It was tried previously in Isabella's Spain and in Dreyfus's France. Did not work. Liberal democracy does not work. We have to have a federated democracy, which recognizes the existence of various differing social formations.
So it seemed to be an ideal time for Bund to be resurrected right now, with there seems to be a growing discontent among all peoples of the world, whether it's the Arab Spring or the Occupy movement, that in one way or another is beginning to articulate discontent with capitalism. And capitalism in the Occupy Wall Street sense, the verdict is still out on exactly where the battle line is going to be drawn, but also the Arab Spring is riding against imperialism in some ways.
Yes.
And so the Bund, by combating both of those, Zionism in many ways seems to encapsulate capitalism and imperialism, perhaps.
Yes. I mean, the naive socialist Zionists thought that they were forming a socialist country when they formed the Zionist state. But that soon dissolved into ordinary, capitalist economy, which gradually rolled back the various social welfare programs, which is what the Occupy Tel Aviv and Jerusalem movements are all about now. Because war became more important than social programs. Even though war with the Palestinians is not necessary. The Palestinians are not waging war on Israel. It's Israel which is waging war on the Palestinians. Every day here we have F-16 fighter planes flying over Nablus. Why?
To terrorize.
Yeah, to terrorize people. There's no Palestinian Air Force here.
Yeah, there's no airport to begin with. Yeah. So you think the Tel Aviv protests are actually, has anyone written on this? Do you know of the J14 Tel Aviv protest actually echoing, forgotten, submerged strands of early socialist Zionism?
They don't know about Bundism. It's been suppressed.
Or Bundism, but not even Bundism, the early Zionists who were...
They don't know anything about the socialist predecessors like Rosa Luxemburg or
even the Zionists like Gordon. I mean, Luxemburg was probably anti-Zionist.
Or Bronstein to Trotsky. They don't know about this at all, except for those families who transmitted the information to their children. This has been effectively suppressed by the Zionist educational system.
So was there like a civil war between an ideological civil war between the socialists in the early 1900s who became Zionists and those who became Bundists? Did people like A.D. Gordon and Baruch what was his name? Yeah.
He was sort of a social democratic Zionist, who had this theory that since the Jews were an inverted pyramid, and they had a smaller working class in proportion to the middle class than would otherwise be found in other cultures, that this pyramid needed to be turned around by means of the formation of a nation state, which would transform Jewish people into working class people. Because they would adopt the positions in that society that the working class, and that incidentally called for the boycott of Palestinian labor. So, and the formation of the Histadrut, which was exclusively Jewish at one point. So it was a racist socialist theory of Jewish working class formation, but subordinate to a bourgeois theory of Zionism. So it's bizarre, and so the socialist Zionists, are sort of reactionary at the same time as being supposedly socialist. It didn't work. Their theory of socialism did not work, and the rightists have now taken over because socialist Zionism is not logical. And Zionism as an ideology leads to a rightist ideology. It's the true nature of Zionism.
I found this quote on the internet. The tragic peculiarities of Jewish society could not be eliminated by seeking to isolate it from decaying capitalist society as a whole. The inverted pyramid of the Jews could not possibly be reversed in Israel, while the normal pyramid of other peoples was itself in the process of crumbling apart. And the world proletarian revolution is alone capable of normalizing Jewish history. And within the framework of decaying capitalism, no solution is possible. Is that how you see a kind of because the new International Bund would repeat the idea of the old Bundists that Jewish emancipation, so to speak, is only possible through capitalists, through the destruction of capitalism.
No. The Bund went further than that. That was the Marxist theory. The Marxist theory of Jewish liberation in Marx's pamphlet on the Jewish question theorized that the Jews would be liberated as Jews and would be liberated from capitalism by the anti-capitalist revolution, and that Jews had to liberate themselves from themselves, according to Marx, because Jews were creating capitalism. Why? Because Jews were small merchants, and they were selling things. So they were capitalists, supposedly, nascent capitalists. And the reason why Jews were merchants is because the Christian employers would not employ Jews as workers. So Jews had to form their own ghetto economies. Just as the Palestinians here now do the same. They have all these workshops all over the place. And they have a lot of small businessmen all over the place. Here in Nablus, with these small workshops that are producing very fine goods.
And that's what the Jews were for.
That's what the Jews were, the same thing, That doesn't mean, that the Jews wanted to be capitalists or wanted to be merchants. It's just that they were forced to be so.
That doesn't even fit the definition of a capitalist in Marxist terms. A capitalist would be someone who employs others' labor power to leech the profits off of it.
Yes.
Not an entrepreneur.
Yes. Well, the small merchants here, they do employ a certain number of workers, maybe 5. Okay? Well, but this is exaggerated out of all proportion by Marx.
But there was also the Jews' role as money lenders, that people like Marx.
Well, there were some Jewish money lenders, yes. There were some non-Jewish money lenders, but the Jews were better at it than the Christian money lenders because they had an international network. But the number of Jews who were money lenders was, how many Jewish money lenders could there be? 10, 12, please. What does that got to do with the Jewish people?
Yeah.
So, but all of a sudden, Jews were usurers according to Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is racist, it's anti-Semitic. And the Christians have not even come to realize that. It's a very big problem of anti-Semitism that exists still. And it is incorrect to say that anti-Semitism has passed away. At the very least, one could say that it is latent or unconscious anti-Semitism. A lot will begin by saying, I'm not an anti-Semite, but, that sort of thing. No, well, that's called latent, anti-Semitism.
Yeah. What's the but followed by?
By some insult or another.
Yeah.
Now,
like I'm not anti-Semitic, but I don't like how the Jews have sequestered themselves.
Yes.
From people to their history.
And this is was propagated amongst the Arabs as well by the Nazi movement. When it was flourishing, they intervened in the Arab countries to promote anti-Jewish propaganda, like the publication of Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which still circulates. And now is replicated in various forms. I would say that the book by Walter Meisner, The Zionist Lobby, is an update of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Yes. Because they have slipped into referring to it as the Jewish Lobby, and they also support the idiot called Gilad Altzman, who is a former Israeli Zionist who became supposedly anti-Zionist, but in fact became a Christian anti-Jewish propagandist. And if he can play a saxophone, he should stick to that and not try to pretend that he's a political philosopher.
But you can't, Mearsheimer and Walt, even though they may slip into Protocols of Elders of Zion and talk and call it the Jewish lobby, you can't deny the tremendous role of the Israel lobby and AIPAC in America.
Oh yeah, there's a lobby, yes.
But the
mistake is to think that it is a dominant force in American political culture, because how can one say that AIPAC, which is based upon 2% of the population in the United States, is more powerful than the 30% of the population in the United States, which follows the Christian evangelical movement, which is pro-Zionist, and which controls the Republican Party now, and which now controls the Congress, and which, cut off funding, to the Palestine Authority because they had applied for independent recognition, by the General Assembly, by the United Nations. Okay, so Congress, the United States Congress, which cut off funding, to the PA, and later on, had to reestablish it because it provides for the security apparatus, which calms things down here for Israel. Israel actually asked the Congress to reestablish this funding for the PA. About a month after they cut it off. But they cut off the funding, not because of the Zionist lobby, not because of Israel, and the proof is that Israel asked them to reinstate the funding, because of the Christian mentality that infects a third of the American population, which considers that Israel is the proper place for Jews to be, Jewish Americans, and which actually promotes the idea of the United States as a Christian nation state, and in effect, thinks that the Jewish Americans should go to Israel and lead the United States to them. Now, this is the tendency that is dominant, not AIPAC. It is far more powerful. It obviously controls the Congress. It obviously controls the Republican Party. It obviously controls the Tea Party movement.
Do you think that AIPAC has, or more broadly, Israel's concerns have any role in U.S. interventions in the Middle East since 9/11 in terms of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
They supported those interventions, yes, but it is not so simple. When you consider the war between Iraq and Iran, for instance, under Saddam Hussein, the United States supported who? Iraq. Who did Israel support? Israel supported Iran.
Because they didn't want Iraq to become very powerful.
Yes. So where is this, coincidence of Israel and the United States, foreign policy? There is none.
So the gesture of pointing to Israeli interest as the main explanation for American foreign policy is almost kind of anti-Semitic because of that.
Yes.
It totalizes and generalizes.
It's just
you think it's motivated by an unconscious protocols of the elders of Zion.
That's right. It's the protocols of the elders of Zion, which is the Zionist fabrication, just trying to say that the Jews were controlling the world. And then the Nazis used this to say that the Jews had controlled Europe to the extent that they caused the First World War and caused the defeat of Germany. It was all the Jews' fault. No, this is insidious propaganda, and it affects great sectors of thought, including Arab political culture, including the Palestine Solidarity Movement, including the Jewish political culture itself. Many of the Zionists believe that themselves, and they think, oh yes, this is good.
Believe that they control the world?
Yeah.
Do you also think it's, tell me some of the ways that you think anti-Semitism, if it's latent or unconscious, has infected the Jewish anti-Zionist movement? Do you think that it has in some ways? I mean, is there like a strong, assimilationist tendency, at least?
Yes, very strong. But it is declining, In the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, I used to go to the Jewish Marxists, the Jewish leftists, and say, look, you've got to speak out, in solidarity with the Palestinians. It's your responsibility as a Jewish person. And they would reply, I'm not Jewish, I'm a Marxist. Okay. 10, 20 years later, all of a sudden, after 2000, when the Palestinian Intifada breaks out again, and they realize that this is, a major political phenomenon in world politics, and they have matured enough to realize that they should be paying attention to international politics and not just their provincial politics. They say, oh yes, we support the Palestinians now. And they came into the Jewish Palestinian solidarity movements, but as Marxists. And they considered that they were speaking out then as Jewish people, which they had refused to do so before. They took this on, as an identity because it got them the attention of the Christian public, which was willing to listen to an anti-Zionist, or an anti-occupation critique from a Jewish perspective, because they got a voice. They were listened to. The media actually wanted them to speak out, because there was a debate about, what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, because the Palestinians were revolting. Why were they revolting? Why was this happening? They were supposed to be living, in a happy paradise, provided by the Zionist movement. Okay, so good, they come to the movement, but then they reject working in the Jewish community itself. They would only go and speak to the Christian community as Jews, because it gave them a voice. But working amongst the Jews, no, they rejected the Jewish community because they considered the Jewish community to be hopelessly Zionist, which wasn't the case. Otherwise, they'd be living in Israel. But they never even thought of this. They haven't thought through what they're doing at all. So the Jewish Marxists who come into the Palestine Solidarity movement went into it to exploit it politically, opportunistically. And they still have to learn, how to really provide true solidarity for the Palestinian people, because they're not doing a good job.
This is a tendency that still exists today.
For instance, in Canada, we formed the Alliance of Concerned Jewish Canadians. And all sorts of Jewish Marxists came to join it after I and Michael Benazon founded it. And later they split off and formed Independent Jewish Voices of Canada because they couldn't bring themselves to differentiate themselves from the Palestine Solidarity movement after this, who carried anti-Jewish verbiage with them. For instance, the first point of disagreement was about the Gaza War. Now, some called this a Holocaust. As a Holocaust family survivor, I pointed out this was not a Holocaust, that it was a piece of propaganda to do so, and it would not service the Palestinians to use language like that because, anybody
would alienate the Zionists even further.
It would alienate the Jewish people.
Yeah.
It would not serve to educate the Zionists, and it would turn off the Christians who would be thinking, that this is, exaggerated, propaganda. This actually has a certain anti-Semitic bent to it, and therefore they didn't want to go for it. They wouldn't, be convinced by it. And if they were, then what a terrible thing they were doing, if they were bringing Christians to some anti-Semitic conclusion. Then, others went even further, like ex-Israelis like Israel Shamir and Gilad Altzman, who started to use Christian anti-Semitic rhetoric, like the Jews killed Jesus Christ, they would say. and they're doing the same to the Palestinians now. Not just the Zionists, they would say the Jews, as a whole, are doing this. So this is anti-Jewish, it's not anti-Zionist.
Well, what Gilad Altzman seems to do to me is he locates the root of Zionist evil in
Jewish identity, in Jewishness. He doesn't know what Jewishness is. He doesn't know anything about the Jewish Bund. He was educated as a Zionist, and he knows nothing of Jewish political culture.
Well, at least in his musical career, he actually does a lot of the things you were saying earlier, as a Jewish person should do. His music is a fusion of many different cultures. It has a very international feel.
Yes, as he says himself, he was inspired by African American jazz, but he doesn't know what he is, what he's doing, and what he's saying. He's not politically educated. He's very ignorant. And it's incredible, that so many people will actually read what he has, what he puts out as his writings, which I don't even believe he writes himself.
Really? You don't think he writes them himself?
No. Same with Israel Shamir. I saw Israel Shamir speaking in one time. He can barely speak in English. And yet he's writing, English prose, political prose. No, he's not writing that stuff. He's a front man for a right-wing organization.
So what happened to the Bund after World War II? It was basically destroyed, but then didn't some Bundists come and become leftist Zionists in Israel?
Some went to live in Israel because, as you may know, 48% of the Jewish refugees after the Holocaust went to live in Israel because they couldn't get a visa to go live in any other country. 52% chose to go to the United States or Canada, but it took a while for my father, for instance, to get a visa to go to Canada, even though his sister was inviting him to do so as a Canadian citizen, because Canada didn't want to have Jewish refugees coming there. So it was very difficult to get a visa to go to any other country. So many of the Jewish survivors, and who were Bundists, of course, ended up going to Israel, but they were certainly not in the leadership of the Zionist movement. They were just living there as Holocaust survivors, in poverty, in isolation, and afraid of speaking out. They were suppressed. So now we have to assert ourselves. We have to take on our responsibility, and we have to take pride in what we have preserved as Jewish political thought, and relaunch it, for the benefit of all the Jewish people and for the benefit of the Palestinians.
What are some of the gems of Jewish political thought that we have preserved that we should take pride in?
This concept of national cultural autonomy. This applies not only to the Jewish people, it applies in many, many different contexts.
The Palestinian people, in some ways, other if they want their own
No. National cultural autonomy applies to the Israelis.
In what sense?
When you have a united society here, we have an integrated territory. There's a lot of Israelis who live in the West Bank now. There's still a lot of Palestinians who live in Israel as citizens, 1.5 million, and neither is going to be leaving. Okay. So, there's no territorial contiguity in order to form a separate Palestinian nation state.
Oh, so you think that a lot of the one state, two state verbal battles are actually operating from a flawed paradigm of nation state?
That's right, both are. I spoke about this, at Nasha University last week.
Oh, yeah.
And I provided a third opinion to the one state and the two state solution theorists. Now, you have to get out of that segregationist mentality because the problem, because you can't separate, the peoples into two states, two nation states, first of all. Okay. It would be disaster, and it's also the same, idea in a certain sense as the right-wing Zionists who want to remove the presence of the Palestinians and put them into ghettos, Bandustans, in the West Bank somewhere with autonomy. Now, the one-state solution, it provides for a democratic secular Palestine, the old PLO formula, which is a state formation which would be based upon one homogeneous culture. In other words, it would be pretending that there would be one nation for one state. There would be no differentiation between all the citizens. Everybody would have equal civil rights. Equal rights, yeah. But this doesn't work because there's an inequality between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israelis are rich compared to the Palestinians. You know, so what is supposed to happen? The Palestinians are supposed to be forming a lower working class, you know, who works as hewers of water, you know, for the Israelis forever and ever. No, this is the same sort of parallel that exists in Canada between the French Canadians and the English Canadians. The French Canadians were supposed to be, according to the Durham report, the hewers of water, the drawers of water and hewers of wood.
Yeah, that was,
you know, the biblical formula. Yeah, you know, no way. You know, this is what is led to by the one-state solution. You know, it's not sufficient. One has to have autonomy for each nation so they can have their own independence within a social federation, and with their autonomy, they can have their own development. They can promote their own development without being subordinate economically or politically to the other nation.
How could that?
Furthermore, one-state solution doesn't work because, you know, it doesn't allow for the return of the refugees. Because if they're saying, oh yes, we're all mixed, you know, so let's have an equal society here. But what about the refugees? It doesn't allow for the return of the refugees, you know, because how is it to be decided that the refugees are going to return? You know, so you know you have an election. Now, if the Israelis win because they have 50 plus 1 votes, they're not going to allow the refugees to return. If the Palestinians were to win the election, 50 plus 1 votes, and say, oh, now we're going to invite the refugees back, then there would be civil war. So the one-state solution as a concept does not function, does not work. You have to have national cultural autonomy for the Israelis so they can have their own language, their own schools, their own religion if they want, their own administration, you know, and they can have their own autonomy, but they have to live together with the Palestinians who will have their own autonomy as well. And this allows for the return of the refugees because there's no automatic majority anymore. It's not majority rule anymore in a liberal democracy. It doesn't work here.
How could there be two governmental apparatuses?
Because you have each government forming a federative council on a proportional basis. And they each allocate resources to their own people on that basis. But within each people, within each nation, they have their own legal system, their own schools, etc., etc., etc. You know, so nobody can complain that they're being dominated by the other. They can have what they want.
So there would be two separate systems bridged by a federated council.
That's right. Now, how do you develop this? How is this constructed? By a mechanism called the Constituent Assembly, in which you have the delegates from various civil society organizations, here and internationally, amongst the refugees, coming together and deciding by consensus how such a society will be federated and formed up.
So everyone would have to agree.
Yes, there would have to be accommodation by means of national cultural autonomy, which is the mechanism by which there is a consensus formed.
And then over time, do you think some of the separate governmental and cultural institutions could crossbreed and influence each other in a healthy and productive way where one doesn't happen to the other?
Yes, because there's going to be,
it's obviously going to be mixing.
There is going to be Jewish, Palestinian, dual identities formed. You know, there are going to be families that are going to be formed. And there are going to be children that are both Jewish and Palestinian. You know, there's going to be integration. Those who don't want to integrate, you know, their families don't have to, but it's not going to be forbidden. Right now in Israel, you can only get married by an Orthodox rabbi or by an imam. That is, you either have to remain Jewish or you have to remain Muslim. It is forbidden.
There are Christian marriages?
Yes, I suppose, but I'm talking about the two major. You know, it is forbidden for Jewish people to be married with Palestinians. It is also forbidden for Palestinians to be married with other Palestinians who live in the West Bank. That's another problem. But it's, you know, the ridiculousness of the situation, you know, compounds itself enormously.
So do you think within this federation of, you know, that allows for natural cultural autonomy, would there be any overarching country designation? I mean, like the way that...
what the name of the country would be, for instance, people can call the country what they want, but they will come to a common agreement, for legal purposes, to call it probably the Federation of Israel-Palestine or the Federation of Palestine-Israel, have a dual name or something like that. No problem, no big deal. Or it could just be called Canaan, the original name of the country.
Canaan, yeah. That'd be great.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you think that the world could be restructured in this way?
Yes, Canada has to be restructured in that way. Otherwise, Quebec is going to separate from Canada. I live in Quebec. The last referendum voted 49.3% in favor of independence, separating from Canada. Canada offered to change the constitution of the country to accommodate Quebec in a special way, recognizing that it had a national character to it, called special status. Never did it.
It didn't do it.
And never changed the constitution. So Quebec is still treated as a province like the other 10 provinces, and it is not allocated resources on a proportional basis. And the Quebecers, or in English, or the Québécois in French, do not accept this condition. And there are various movements which call for the independence of Quebec. Even the socialist movement, which is called Québec Solidaire, which is independent of the middle-class party called Parti Québécois. Now, there's full independence parties in Quebec, and there is two parties that are for autonomy of one sort or another, both of which come from the liberal bourgeois direction. All the parties in Quebec are in favor of Quebec identity in one form or another. And Canada, the English Canadians, even the Canadian leftists, have not come to this realization. So it applies to Quebec, National Cultural Autonomy, if it is to remain in the Canadian Federation, and Canada calls itself a federation. It applies to any other country that has an indigenous population that has been displaced or genocided, or the indigenous population require their national autonomy. They're not going to assimilate into some sort of colonial culture that's taken over their country.
So it could be antidote to imperialism, or a way to transcend.
That's it. It's the antidote to internal imperialism. Yeah. So this has been an excellent, discussion, that I haven't had with anybody else. This is not written down. This is an original documentary piece of work that you've done. I congratulate you, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wish that people will pay attention to this piece of work.
Yeah. I'll put it on the internet.
Very good. Okay.